What's up guys, you're watching JayzTwoCents, and today we're going to learn how to build a computer using all of this. Okay guys, so as I mentioned, today we're going to learn how to build a computer using these components here. This build had one thing in mind and one thing in mind only, besides being as much power as we could put in a small case, but that one thing being a small case. This buyer has portability as the most important factor to his build. So for that, I went ahead and chose the Silverstone FT03 Fortress case. As you can see here, it is very small, it is very light. And we are going to talk a little bit more about this later when we start the build, but it's quite a bit different than my 900D, which you're used to seeing. For graphics, we're going with the EVGA GTX 780 Superclocked graphics card. A lot of people may or may not like Team NVIDIA. Doesn't matter. This particular buyer wanted to go with something as powerful as they could get for right now, minus the Titan. Didn't want to waste any money. For that, we chose the GTX 780. For a power supply, we are using the Silverstone Strider Gold Evolution. It is a 80 plus gold rated power supply, and this power supply unit is a 750 watt with 850 max output capability. We're not going to use anywhere near that amount of power. And because we're putting it in such a small case, we are using the Silverstone Strider Gold PP05 short cable kit. This allows us to take out, because this is a fully modular power supply, so it allows us to get rid of those long cables, and we can have much tidier cable management in this case by using this short cable kit specifically for our power supply. To keep everything cool, we're going to toss out those Silverstone fans, and we're going to toss in some SP120 Corsair fans. These fans are amazing fans. I definitely live by these fans. I've got 12 of them in my case alone. Keeping the CPU cool, we're going to go ahead and go with the H80i here from Corsair. It is an all-in-one unit. There's nothing you have to do maintenance-wise. It's just completely contained, no filling, no draining. Just plug it in and go. And it is software controlled, so it'll control the fans based on its needs. For RAM, we are going with the Corsair Vengeance Pro. This is a 16 gigabyte kit, a dual channel kit, 1866 megahertz, but we are going to be overclocking this RAM a little bit. For the CPU, we are using the Intel 4770K. A lot of people are going to wonder why I went with this CPU, considering my entire video about why I went 3770K. The bottom line is, this is what makes sense for this buyer. This buyer is not going to be doing an upgrade very often. In fact, this computer needs to last him many years. So for that, we went ahead and chose with the 4770K, just so that he can have the newer, the newest generation, to start out his longevity of his computer. Plus, we're not going with a massive overclock, just a small, very, very humble overclock, which the 4770K will be more than capable of. Housing the processor is going to be our ASUS Republic of Gamers Maximus 6 Genie. It is a MicroATX board. Because it's going in such a small case, we've got to make sure that it can fit in there. And I chose this motherboard because it's got all of the onboard features that you'd come to expect with a high-end motherboard like something from the Republic of Gamers line. It's got an amazing Ethernet card, an amazing sound card. It's got fan control. Overclocking on this is amazing, and it's capable of future upgrades for SLI if he wants to put another card in here. We'll get more into that later. And for our hard drive space, we've got two data drives here that we're going to be using. When you've got a fast computer like this and you're going to overclock it and you've got a really fast graphics card and a really fast processor and motherboard, really fast RAM, you need to have a fast hard drive to go along with it. And for that, we are using the Samsung 840 EVO 750 gigabyte solid state drive. And just in case that's not enough, doesn't want to fill this up, we went ahead and went with a Toshiba 2 terabyte 7200 RPM 64 megabyte cache hard drive for all of his pictures, movies, maybe some adult pornography, who knows. Whatever he wants to put on here, he can put on whatever he wants, not have to worry about space. And last but not least, we have got an 8 gigabyte flash drive. This is going to serve two purposes. You may have noticed we have no optical drive here. We're not putting an optical drive in there. So we're going to be putting the ISO onto here, turning this into one, an installation drive for the operating system, and two, this is also going to be his recovery backup disk in case something happens and he has to have a restore point. We're going to put an initial restore point on here, and then he can do all of his backups to this and have an image of his entire computer. And speaking of operating systems, I know a lot of you immediately are going to not like this, but we are going with Windows 8 in this machine. Like I mentioned, he's not going to be upgrading for a long time. He wants to have as much future-proofing as he can. I'm banking that 8.1 for Windows 8 is going to make a huge difference. I've got some inside sources saying that 8.1 is going to fix a lot of things. So I'm going ahead and taking a chance on that. I'm putting my reputation with this PC build on the line with 8.1. I have confidence in that. If you don't like it, adapt this build to go with Windows 7. Everything will work perfectly fine. Now, just like your grandfather always told you, doing the job... What did Grandpa used to say?
Any job worth doing.
Oh, that's right. Okay. All right. Cut. Now, just like your grandpa used to tell you, any job worth doing is worth doing right. And in order to do it right, you've got to have the right tool. I've got a couple of tools here that you may need at any point in putting together your computer. And these are optional. Really, the only tool you need is going to be a multi-tool screwdriver here. Mine just pulls out. It's got big and small Phillips and flathead screws on there, as well as a nut driver on each end. It's got pretty much your most common sizes that you would need for a computer. You could pick this up at any hardware store, usually less than 10 bucks. You probably won't need any tool besides that. For keeping your wires nice and tidy, we've got ourselves some zip ties. I've got a razor blade just in case I find myself needing to cut something. Very rarely do I need it, but I never have a blade when I need one, so I always keep one in the tool bag. I've got a pair of cutters here. This is really nothing more than cutting your zip ties, the excess, and getting it nice and clean. And you've got a pair of pliers here. Chances are you aren't going to need these, but what tool bag wouldn't be complete without a pair of pliers? And then we've got a small Phillips screwdriver here, which can be used for popping out pins or tucking wires behind things. Really, it's just handy to have a nice small screwdriver in case you need to get into a really tight place. Don't really ever need to use this. As I mentioned, this is pretty much the only tool you will really ever need for putting together your computer. And then last but not least, you have your hardware here. This is going to be specific to your case. Each case comes with its own set of hardware needed for its components. And in this case, it's in this plastic bag. Usually it comes in a little cardboard box, but this is what we're going to be using to put together this case today. Now, one of the first things you want to do when getting your computer ready to be built is you want to get the motherboard situated. Everything you need to build your computer for the motherboard is included inside the box. In this case here, we don't have an anti-static bag. ROG, ASUS never sends anything in an anti-static bag. But we do get a tray in there, and then you've got your I/O plate, SLI bridge, you've got an easy your I/O or your front panel connectors there, and you get a whole bunch of cables here. All right, so for now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and just set up a ghetto test bench here. I don't have a test bench personally. I've never owned one. I probably should get one. I've always just used the ghetto box method. And so we're going to get our motherboard ready here by simply setting our motherboard on the box. It's ghetto, and it works, and it's glorious. Now, normally in getting your PC ready, you would want to set up everything, all the basics onto your motherboard and do a test bench boot. We're not going to do that today because I have high hopes for these components here, but you may, for your first time build, want to set everything up, CPU, RAM, graphics card, and make sure that you at least get a basic post with your components. One of the first things you want to do is get your CPU installed inside of your motherboard, get the pins nice and secure, get everything safe. So go ahead and take out your trusty razor blade here. Try not to cut your fingers off like I have a big habit of doing. And go ahead and get your CPU placed inside of your motherboard. Okay, when installing your CPU chip, you'll notice that you have a gold triangle on one of the corners. If you lift up the socket tab right here, be very gentle. This is going to expose the pins. You definitely don't want anything to get in there, as that will ruin your day. But you're going to notice that there's also not only a gold triangle, but there's also two notches on the side of the CPU, and there are two notches also inside of the socket. So you're just going to simply line those up drop the CPU in there very gently, and we can leave the plastic cover on because when you reposition the socket cover on there and you push this down, it pops that cover right off. So you never have to get involved and get too close with your socket pins because the cover never leaves the socket cover until it's ready. And now our CPU is installed and ready for action. Okay, so now that we're using the Silverstone FT03 and we are going with a MicroATX board, this is going to be a little bit unconventional when it comes to installation on the order that we're about to do things. So if you're using a standard mid-tower, full tower, or even just a super tower case like the 900D behind me, you pretty much would just mount your motherboard in and then you would mount your cooler to it if you're going with a standalone water cooling like the H80 that I have. But because we have no motherboard cutout, there's no hole in the back of this case for the motherboard, we're going to have to do things in a very interesting order. As you can see by looking inside here, we have no motherboard cutout. So that's going to cause a little bit of a problem when it comes to the standard way of installing the motherboard. And some people might be saying, well, why is there no motherboard cutout? Well, in this particular case, right behind the motherboard is where you're going to find your hot swap hard drive installation right here. So it wouldn't do any good to have a motherboard cutout on this case. But if you're doing a basic installation, this is a little bit more advanced than what you'd be dealing with. Normally you wouldn't have this problem to worry about. Okay, so now that we've got our CPU installed on our motherboard, and before we put the cooler on the CPU, there's some things I want to do to get this Silverstone case ready to go. As I mentioned earlier, I don't like the fans that come with this case, especially since they aren't sleeved. And sure, we could sleeve them, but we want to add a bit of style to this build. So we're going to put the SP120 fans in this case. So we're going to go ahead and remove these fans and add a little bit of style. Okay, we're back, and I've decided to do a little bit of a tech tip here for you. I had to do this on my computer as well, on one of my computer builds that I did actually in the past. This is the bracket that we're going to be using right here. This is set to fit 1150 socket. You can see you have the holes here in the motherboard. You can kind of see them right there, a little bit dark. What we're going to do is we're going to flip this upside down here. We're going to take the retaining bracket, we are going to stick them through the hole like so, and we are going to take a small piece of electrical tape to simply hold that on the back as we put it inside of the case. Now some people may look at this and say, oh, that's a ghetto mod. You know what? A lot of custom PCs live because of ghetto mods. And all that's going to do is it may look a little bit tacky, but you know what? You're never going to see it, and it holds the backplate on the whole time that you're setting this inside the case. So what this allows us to do now is get the motherboard inside the case before we install the pump, because it is threaded on here and you're able to take the retaining bracket on the top and tighten it down without the bracket moving around. It allows us to get the board safely inside of the case without having to worry about mounting this pump outside of it, which then increases our chances of actually causing damage. Most cases don't have the standoffs already installed. Those are those brass little, they look like little screws that another screw screws into. Normally you have to install those inside of your case based on the type of motherboard you're installing, whether it be MicroATX, ATX, XLATX, ITX, whatever type of case motherboard you're installing. The standoffs are built into this one. They're already there. I'll lay the case down so you can kind of see they're already built in. So we don't have to worry about doing that. We can just put the motherboard right into the case. And as I mentioned earlier, the hardware that we're going to need to install them to the motherboard is included with the hardware that came with the case. Okay. The first thing you want to do when installing your motherboard in your case is you want to take your I/O plate and get that installed into your case. Normally this would be in the back. In this case it's on the top. But in order to know which way to orient it, whether this way or this way, you're going to have to take a look at your motherboard and see exactly how it's going to be oriented. In this case, the motherboard installs this direction. So take a look at the audio inputs here. You can see that this is the orientation that we are going to install the I/O plates. Okay, so we've got the motherboard installed in the case now. I've installed a red LED light right here that you can kind of sort of see because we want to give some cool little blingy aspects to this case to kind of accent the red that's in here. What we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead, before we put the cooler in here and the RAM in here, we're going to do the front panel installation, the front panel plugs. The motherboard in this case is oriented sideways. So normally what would be at the bottom is now on the side. And I'm usually not a fan of using the little I/O connectors that come in this particular... ASUS is really good about giving you these adapters here that you can use for plugging in your reset switch, your power switch, and all of that stuff. But because we're dealing in such a small case, I'm going to go ahead and use these just to keep things as simple as possible. We also have one here for additional USB if we need it. Okay, so we've gone ahead and installed the front panel connectors, and because this is such a tight case and tight fit, I went ahead and made sure that our H80 fits. And as you can see, the way it installs here is you have a push-pull fan configuration. So we have the radiator and the fan and these screws sandwiching it together on the top of the case. Now, just to make sure that there was no fitment issues, I went ahead and installed that. And as you can see here, we can get our CPU block curves around and it will fit just like this. It's definitely a tight fit, but it's definitely worth it. And then we're going to have our second fan installed on the bottom of the radiator just like this. So we have a nice push-pull configuration for high static pressure and maximum cooling, especially for such a small form factor. So what I'm going to do now before I install the second fan, I'm going to go ahead and get the CPU block mounted. Corsair does come with high quality thermal paste already installed, so don't feel the need to clean that off. Go ahead and use that. And you just saw that I cut a zip tie on that. I like to put a zip tie around these plastic covers when I'm moving them around to make sure that I don't accidentally scrape that. So I just put a zip tie around that to keep this cover from falling off. But now that we're ready to go ahead and move forward with the installation, just cut it off and off you go. Okay, so now that we've got our motherboard installed, we've got our LED light installed, and we've got our front panel connectors installed, the next thing we want to do is we want to get the power supply ready to go. I didn't plug in the USB front, technically top USB ports on here yet, because I want to get the power supply in here in the bottom, and I'm going to kind of run the cables all together. So cable management is definitely going to be a challenge inside this case. So we're going to go ahead and put in the motherboard or the power supply on the bottom, and we're going to get our short cables ready to go, and then we will see you when that's done. Okay guys, we've only been at this a few hours because Jay is OCD, and here's what we've got done so far. We've got the motherboard installed, the CPU installed, we've got the H80i installed, we have got the power supply installed, all the front side inputs from the reset switch, power switch, LED, power LED, we've got the USB 3.0 installed, and we've got all of the Corsair link fans wired up, all of the USB stuff in there. We've got our 8-pin power plug installed right here on the side. And then on the back, as you can see, we've already started some OCD cable management back here. I mean, what we have left to do now is we need to install our RAM. And then we need to install our graphics cards and our hard drives and power for the hard drives. So we're getting near the end here to the point where we're going to do our test boot. And let's go ahead and install some RAM. Okay, this is one time when you don't have to be embarrassed to pull out the motherboard manual. In fact, there's 2 times I recommend that you pull out the motherboard manual. One is when you're hooking up the front panel connectors on your case. Some motherboards have it printed on there, some don't. No problem in looking at the motherboard manual to figure out where those pins go. The other time I always recommend looking at the motherboard manual, even when you're dealing with the same manufacturer. Not all ASUS boards are the same, not all MSI boards are the same, and that's looking at your memory configuration. Naturally, you want to say red is a channel and black is a channel when you're looking at the colors of the DIMM slots. However, in this case, the red is channel 1 and channel 2, or channel A and B. So we're going to install our RAM in both red channels. If we had done red and black, we would have put ourselves in single channel mode, which would have cut our memory bandwidth in half. So we're going to go ahead and take our Vengeance Pro RAM, 16 gigabytes, 2 8 gigabyte sticks, and we're going to install those in our motherboard. And as you can see, we've got kind of a color combination going on here, a nice little ROG red-black in this really kick-ass small form factor case. And there we go. We've got our RAM installed, and if I don't say so myself, this is turning out to be quite a badass looking little system right here. This color scheme, this ROG red and black, it may be done a lot, but I think this looks really damn sexy. I like the way that RAM looks. That is awesome. Okay, so before we go ahead and start buttoning this up and putting in our graphics card, I want to go ahead and install the main fan cage right here that goes in the middle of the case. This one goes in the bottom. And this one goes right here like so. I just want to get this in there so I can plug this into the motherboard and get that out of the way. And as you can see here, it's definitely a tight fit. The H80 is going to push slightly on the center of the fan, but fortunately that's not going to cause any problems. In fact, we can kind of push that up out of the way as we get this ready to go. Alright, we're getting down to the nitty-gritty. We're almost done with this build. We really only have a couple of things left to do. We have to install our data storage, our SSD, and our hard drive. And for that, we're going to be using the included SATA cables that came with the motherboard. This particular motherboard comes with 2 types of SATA cables. One has a 90-degree plug and a straight plug on one end, and then the other cable has 2 straight plugs. For this case, we're going to be using the 2 straight plugs for both of our drives. So we need to run power for our SATA, and we also need to run our SATA cables. and then we have our hard drives installed. And the last thing after that is installing our PCI Express power cables and our GTX 780. So let's go ahead and get this thing finished up. Okay, we've got our hard drives installed here inside of the case. Got the SSD installed here on its little bracket, and we went ahead and opted to put the hard drive inside of the hot swap bay, as you can see right here. I did that because I felt that the easiest way to install the SSD was with the cables facing up, and unfortunately that moves into the other installation area for this hard drive. And so I don't believe this buyer is going to be changing out his hard drive anytime very often, but if he wants to upgrade his hard drive now, he doesn't have to have any installation skills to do it. He doesn't have to take anything apart. He can just drop it right in here, push it down, and the new hard drive is now installed. So now we only have one thing left to do, and that is to flip this thing around, get our PCI Express cables installed, and put that bad boy, that beast of a monster card, that 780 inside here, and then we're going to do our first test boot. Some people would argue that we should have put an AMD card in here. Some people will say we should have put a 690, or we should have even put a Titan in here. The bottom line is this is the card that we chose to go with, and it is massively long. I've not personally held one of these before. I forgot just how big the cards used to be. This is about the length of the 580, and the 680 was a little bit shorter. They shortened up the card a little bit with the 680. This thing is massive, and initially my first thoughts are, uh-oh, this may not fit inside this build, but I already know it's possible because I've seen it done before. But I just want to show you how tight of a fit we really have with this card in this case. Unfortunately, the GeForce green kind of ruins a little bit of the aesthetics, but it's okay because it is just such a massively powerful beast. So let's go ahead and get this thing in here, and then once we hook it up to power, this build, hardware-wise, is complete. All right, well there it is. A lot of you guys questioned on Twitter and Facebook on whether or not all these parts would actually fit, whether or not we could get all those products into this tiny little case, and guess what? It's also very light, and it's still pretty portable. I mean, I could pick up my 900D like this if I wanted to, even if it wasn't water-cooled. The case management, or the wire management on the back, as you can see, is very acceptable. I mean, it's kind of bunched up a little bit right here, but this is where the wiring is intended to go. It's very deep on the back. I've got nothing but great things to say about this case. I mean, I have a couple of gripes, but I'm not going to get into that in this video. GTX 780 fits in there. In fact, we've got about another 1.5 inches worth of space before we hit this fan. So we could have easily fit a 690 in here, or a 7990 if we wanted. So there's plenty of room for graphics cards. Now, a lot of you guys have wondered how airflow is going to work in this case. The way it works is the 120 millimeter fan on the bottom here pulls in from the dual 80 millimeter holes, as you can see right here on the bottom. You could also put two 80 millimeter fans here for more directional airflow if you wanted to do that. Or if you're going to water cool, you could do a dual 80 millimeter radiator there. But that fan on the bottom right here blows air to the graphics card. Now, some of you may have wondered why I didn't go with a custom cooling graphics card, something with like the two fans, like the EVGA or the ASUS DirectCU, or even the Gigabyte, with the three fans, or the Twin Froze, or any of those options, because they're known to be a bit quieter. The problem with a case like this, and the fact that it's got stacked airflow design, is that you have to have directional airflow. And those graphics cards just swirl the air around inside of your case, because they're expecting a bigger case with more fans to exhaust that air. So we have to go with a blower style fan, that way we can exhaust it out the top. We sacrifice a little bit in terms of noise, but this particular buyer was made well aware that it's going to be some noise involved with this fan compared to one of those other custom cooling solutions. He's okay with that. In fact, there have been reports of people putting in those multiple fan graphics cards that are not directional, and they are not the blower or turbine type of fan, and have actually reported overheating problems in their case when using those types of graphics cards. So this card was chosen for a specific reason. Now there's only one thing left to do, that is to button it back up, hook it up, see if we get a good boot, and then install our operating system, and then we start our benchmarking. Okay, so the operating's been installed, everything is updated, all of our drivers are freshly updated. I tried to do a little bit of overclocking on this computer. Unfortunately, this 4770K had absolutely no interest in doing any sort of overclocking beyond 4.2 gigahertz. This chip was just unfortunately a bad luck of the lottery draw, and it has no interest in doing anything above 4.2. But that's okay, because this buyer had only one thing in mind, and that was to get as much power as he could in a small package, but he wasn't interested in going on high overclocks. And for the sake of stability, I think it's a good idea. We were able to cram a lot of very good components inside this tiny little case, and Battlefield 3 runs at over 100 frames per second in all situations, and on some cases it's running in the 150s and 160s and staying up there the entire time. This GTX 780 is a massive beast. It's an amazing card. So with that, there's only one thing left to do. Let's go ahead and turn around and start poning some noobs.